No one warns you about this moment. You walk into a museum expecting history, beauty, maybe a little boredom. You don't expect your understanding of reality to crack. But it happens quietly, slowly. The first time you truly look at an ancient sculpture and stop listening to the explanation, something feels wrong. Not emotionally, logically. The stone in front of you behaves in ways stone should not behave. You see marble that looks like fabric, veils so thin they appear transparent, faces visible beneath stone layers thinner than paper. You see folds that curve inward, undercut so deeply that even modern drills would snap trying to reach them. And your brain begins to resist the explanation you were given as a child. Hammer, chisel, patience, genius. Those words suddenly feel like excuses rather than answers. Marble is not forgiving. It is brittle. It fractures along invisible stress lines. Sculptures know this intimately. One mistake, one vibration too strong, one slip of the wrist, and the entire structure collapses. And yet these sculptures violate every known limitation of the material. The veil doesn't just sit on the face, it presses against skin, it follows cheekbones, it captures tension, it suggests weight, softness, motion. Marble is behaving like cloth. We are told this illusion was achieved through polishing, endless hours of sanding. But polishing removes material uniformly. It cannot create depth where none exists. It cannot carve eyelashes beneath stone layers. It cannot explain how inner folds were refined without destroying outer ones. These are not surface tricks. These are structural impossibilities. Modern sculptures have tried to replicate this effect, not with faith but with science. Lasers, CNC machines, diamond-tipped tools, robotic arms guided by algorithms capable of precision down to microns. The result is always the same. The form may resemble the original, but the soul is gone. The surface looks dead, mechanical, like a copy that understands shape but not matter. This is where a terrifying paradox appears. The more advanced our technology becomes, the less capable we seem to be of reproducing the past. Progress is supposed to accumulate. Knowledge is supposed to expand, but in stonework, history behaves like a collapsing tower. The highest level is in the past. Everything after is a downgrade. At some point, you must ask whether the premise itself is wrong. What if these objects were never carved at all? When you examine the flow of lines, the continuity of form, the absence of tool marks where they should exist, another possibility emerges. What if the marble was not removed, but placed? What if the stone was not hard during creation? What if matter itself was manipulated? This idea sounds absurd only because we are trapped inside a technological narrative that places us at the top. We assume the past was primitive by definition. But that assumption is not based on evidence, it is based on comfort. Because accepting the alternative would mean admitting that we are not the peak of civilization, but the aftermath. Imagine a technology capable of altering the physical state of stone, temporarily softening it or printing it layer by layer with molecular precision. Marble dust combined with binders unknown to us, or machines capable of reorganizing crystal lattices the way modern printers organize plastic filament. To us, this sounds futuristic. To another civilization, it may have been routine. This would explain everything: the fluidity, the detail, the impossibility. And it would also explain something else that history never quite resolves: why these masterpieces appear suddenly without prototypes and disappear just as suddenly without successors. Official history loves to assign names: singular geniuses, lone masters, romantic figures who supposedly possessed secrets no one else had. One such sculptor is credited with creating the most famous veiled figures. We are told he was the last, the final keeper of an ancient technique, that he took the secret to his grave. But biographies are stubborn things. Dates don't bend for romance, And when you compare the timeline of this man's life with the appearance of the sculptures attributed to him, the story falls apart. According to records, he was deeply involved in political movements, revolutionary activity, and military leadership during the exact period when these sculptures were allegedly being created. Let that sink in. While commanding troops and navigating political chaos, masterpieces were appearing in foreign countries, exhibited, sold, transported. Not years later, simultaneously. This is not humanly possible. No amount of genius allows a man to be in two places at once, producing work that requires constant physical presence. Unless the name attached to the sculpture was not the creator, but the administrator, the legal owner, the brand. History does this often. When artifacts appear without context, authorship is assigned to maintain continuity. Names become labels applied retroactively to objects that already exist. This keeps the timeline intact and prevents uncomfortable questions. And this brings us to something far more unsettling. Why are so many ancient statues damaged in the same way? Walk through any major museum and you'll notice the pattern. Perfect bodies, perfect drapery, perfect anatomy. And then, absence. Hands missing, heads missing, faces erased, objects gone. We are told this is the work of time, vandals, earthquakes, transportation accidents. But time does not amputate selectively. When stone falls, it shatters randomly. It breaks where physics dictates, not where information is stored. Yet many statues show clean removals, controlled destruction, as if someone knew exactly what needed to be removed without compromising the rest of the structure. Hands are removed at the wrist, heads at the neck. Objects disappear entirely, even when preserving them would have been easier than destroying them. This is not decay, this is editing. So what was removed? If these figures held ordinary objects, there would be no reason for such consistency. Spears, scrolls, goblets, these would not threaten historical narratives. But imagine something else, a device, a tool, something technological, something that instantly breaks the illusion of primitive antiquity. The presence of advanced technology in ancient statuary would collapse the linear model of history. It would prove that civilization does not move upward in a straight line. It would suggest loss, regression, replacement. Removing the object but leaving the statue creates confusion without proof. Cutting off the hand erases context. Removing the head erases identity. What remains is safe, beautiful, harmless. Art without information. This is how history is neutralized. And once you notice this pattern in sculpture, you begin to see it everywhere else. Architecture stops making sense. Ancient buildings feel wrong in scale, doors too tall, steps too large, windows placed where light behaves strangely. We are told this is symbolism, grandeur, religious exaggeration. But builders don't design for metaphor, they design for bodies. What if these structures were not built for us? What if humanity inherited this world instead of creating it? This idea, often dismissed as fringe speculation, is surprisingly old. It appears in ancient texts, religious traditions, and myths that speak not of creation, but arrival, not of building, but settling. Even the Bible hints at this when read without filters. The earth was not empty, it was devastated, not void, but ruined. Ruins imply predecessors. So where did they go? This is where the investigation becomes truly disturbing. Skeptics ask where the evidence of a lost civilization is. Where are the megacities, the machines, the infrastructure? But this question assumes that evidence must look familiar. Steel, concrete, circuits. What if it doesn't? What if the largest remnants are mistaken for nature itself? Mountains, canyons, landscapes we attribute to millions of years of erosion. But what if some of them are not geological at all? Consider Devil's Tower in Wyoming, a colossal structure rising nearly 400 meters above the plains. Perfect hexagonal columns stacked with machine-like regularity. Official science tells us it is volcanic. Molten magma cooled slowly, forming geometry. But molten material does not behave this way. Liquids cool chaotically. They crack, they warp. They do not self-organize into flawless repeating structures across massive scales. Hexagons are not a signature of chaos. They are a signature of life. Honeycombs, cellular tissue, plant fibers. Nature uses hexagons when efficiency and strength are required. If you examine the cross-section of a plant stem under a microscope, you will see the same pattern. Bundles of hexagonal tubes designed to transport nutrients and provide structural integrity. Now imagine that structure scaled up millions of times. Devil's Tower does not resemble frozen lava. It resembles wood, petrified wood, a stump. And if that is true, then the implications are staggering, because a stump's diameter is only a fraction of a tree's height, which means the original organism may have reached kilometers into the sky, a biosphere of giants, vegetation that reshaped climate itself. And if plants were that large, what lived among them? Ecosystems scale together. You do not find tiny creatures thriving in colossal environments. A world of massive flora implies massive fauna. Giants. Suddenly, ancient myths stop sounding like fiction and start sounding like degraded memory. Frescoes depicting oversized figures beside humans are no longer symbolic exaggerations. They are literal records. Gods were not supernatural beings. They were physically superior ones. This explains megalithic construction effortlessly. Stones weighing hundreds of tons are not impressive to a being 30 meters tall. They are bricks. No alien technology required, no anti-gravity, just scale. And suddenly, the statues make sense, not as art, but as documentation. Once the idea of giants enters the equation, history stops resisting. It starts confessing. Suddenly, problems that scholars have argued over for centuries dissolve effortlessly. Megalithic construction, impossible logistics, inexplicable strength, and architectural scale no longer require imaginary explanations. They simply require proportion. Look at the stone blocks of Baalbek, some weigh over 1,000 tons. Engineers today struggle to even move replicas a fraction of that mass. We are told ancient builders used wooden rollers, ropes, and manpower. But wood collapses under such weight. Ropes snap. Friction alone makes the task impossible. These explanations survive not because they are logical, but because they are familiar. Introduce a builder 20 or 30 meters tall, and the problem vanishes. For such a being, a multi-ton stone is not a monument. It is a construction unit, a brick. Ergonomics change everything. Architecture stops being miraculous and becomes mundane. High doorways in ancient cathedrals were not designed to inspire awe. They were designed for clearance. Giant steps were not symbolic. They were comfortable. Sunken ground floors were not basements. They were original entrances for a taller world. And once you see that, you begin to notice something else. Evidence that doesn't fit into the category of architecture or sculpture, but into something far more uncomfortable: everyday objects. Hidden in museum storage rooms and private collections around the world are items historians dismiss as curiosities, oddities, cultural exaggerations. Objects that supposedly existed only to demonstrate power or faith. Giant crowns, massive tools, oversized furniture, and most disturbingly, enormous books. These books are not decorative, they are not ceremonial, they are functional. Their bindings are worn, their pages are smudged, corners are rounded from repeated handling, margins contain notes, corrections, use marks. These are not display pieces, these are reference materials. Some of these volumes stand over a meter tall and weigh hundreds of kilograms. Turning a single page requires multiple people. For a human of modern proportions, reading such a book is absurd. It would require scaffolding, assistance, and physical endurance. No culture creates impractical tools for daily use, unless the user was not human-sized. For a being 4 or 5 meters tall, these books are not giant, they are portable, comfortable. The font size, line spacing, and page thickness suddenly make sense. The ergonomics align perfectly, just not with us. These are not oversized books. We are undersized readers. And if such books exist, then so does the knowledge they contain. Knowledge that does not belong to our version of history. Knowledge that describes a world functioning on principles we no longer understand. This brings us inevitably to the most controversial keeper of written history on Earth, the Vatican. For centuries, it has positioned itself as the guardian of truth, doctrine, and continuity. But it is also the largest private archive on the planet. Kilometers of underground shelves, documents inaccessible to scholars, texts sealed away indefinitely. Officially, these archives contain administrative records and theological correspondence. Unofficially, they contain history that never made it into textbooks. During the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries, massive reorganizations of museum collections and archives took place across Europe. Artifacts were relocated, reclassified, removed from public access. Entire collections vanished into restricted storage. What remained on display was curated carefully. Safe artifacts were shown, dangerous ones were hidden. If statues existed depicting advanced devices, they could not simply be destroyed without raising suspicion. But they could be modified. Hands removed, heads replaced, objects amputated, context erased. The result would look like damage caused by time, not intent. And this pattern repeats across continents. Statues with intact bodies but missing hands. Faces erased while clothing remains flawless. Helmets removed but hair preserved. The informational elements are gone. The aesthetic ones remain. This is not erosion. This is censorship. Because if even one statue survived intact, holding something unmistakably technological, the entire narrative of human progress would collapse instantly. The story of gradual development from stone tools to smartphones would be exposed as fiction. And fiction, once exposed, loses power. The idea that history is controlled is uncomfortable. But history has always been controlled. Victors write it. Institutions curate it. What doesn't fit is labeled myth, exaggeration, or symbolism. Giants become metaphors. Gods become allegories. Technology becomes magic. But magic is just technology viewed through the wrong lens. Once you accept this, a much larger pattern emerges. The world itself begins to look artificial, not in a digital sense, but in a constructed one, like an abandoned system repurposed by its inheritors. Look at ancient aqueducts, perfect gradients maintained over kilometers without modern surveying tools. Look at road networks that align with astronomical events. Look at cities built atop earlier cities, their foundations buried, their original purpose forgotten. This is not development. This is occupation. We are not builders. We are tenants. This explains why so much ancient infrastructure appears over-engineered for human use, why materials outlast their supposed creators, why modern attempts at replication fall short. We are using tools meant for a different species. And now we return to the most unsettling idea of all, the possibility that humanity did not evolve into this world, but was introduced into it. Ancient texts across cultures speak not of creation, but of arrival, of gods descending, of humans being placed, of a world prepared in advance. These stories are dismissed as myth because we read them through modern assumptions, but myths often preserve truth when facts are erased. The biblical phrase, often translated as "the earth was without form and void," carries a very different meaning in older interpretations. Not empty, but ruined, devastated, laid waste. You don't devastate nothing. You devastate something that existed before. This implies catastrophe. But skeptics ask the obvious question. If a global civilization collapse occurred, where are the scars? Where is the crater? Where is the wreckage? Where are the twisted remains of machines? The answer may be hiding in plain sight. We call them landscapes. Mountains, cliffs, canyons. Formations attributed to millions of years of erosion, but erosion is slow, chaotic, and inconsistent. Yet many of these structures exhibit symmetry, repetition, and patterns that resemble design more than decay. We return again to Devil's Tower, to Giant's Causeway, to basalt columns across the world that share the same geometry. Official science insists on volcanic explanations, but these explanations require lava to behave like a precision manufacturing process. Liquids do not self-organize into perfection. Life does. When organic matter undergoes mineralization, its structure can be preserved. Carbon replaced with silicon, flesh turned to stone, petrification on a scale we struggle to imagine. If Devil's Tower is a stump, then entire mountain ranges may be forests, not metaphorically, literally. The remains of silicon-based vegetation that once dominated the planet. And the math becomes horrifying. A stump 300 meters wide suggests a tree kilometers tall. Forests that reached into the clouds. Ecosystems operating on scales incompatible with human life. Which means humanity did not belong to that world. We arrived after it fell. Or we were small even then. This reframes everything. Climate myths, flood legends, the idea of a great reset. A world wiped clean not once, but repeatedly. Each cycle leaving fragments too large or too durable to erase completely. And this brings us to the most disturbing hypothesis of all. Civilizations may be cyclical. Not metaphorically, mechanically. A species rises. It masters matter. It reshapes the planet. And at some point, it becomes unstable, dangerous, unsustainable. And then, something intervenes. A reset. Whether natural, artificial, or deliberate is unclear, but the result is the same. Infrastructure collapses. Knowledge is lost. Survivors inherit ruins they cannot understand. And they call them wonders. If this is true, then humanity is not unique. We are not the first, and we may not be the last. The question is not whether giants existed. The question is whether we are approaching the same threshold they once crossed. When all the fragments are placed together, the picture that emerges is not mysterious, it is terrifying. Statues that behave like manufactured objects, architecture scaled for bodies far larger than ours, landscapes that resemble biological remains, books written for hands and eyes that were never human-sized. These are not isolated anomalies, they are pieces of a single forbidden narrative. We are not standing at the peak of history, we are standing on debris. This realization forces an uncomfortable shift in perspective. Everything we call ancient may actually be post-apocalyptic. Temples are not primitive attempts at grandeur, they are repurposed structures whose original functions were lost. We decorate their interiors, light candles inside them, and assign them religious meaning because we no longer understand their engineering. A broken machine becomes a shrine when its purpose is forgotten. This explains why so much ancient architecture feels excessive. Walls too thick, foundations too deep, stone blocks too precise. These buildings were not designed to survive centuries. They were designed to survive catastrophes, floods, impacts, atmospheric collapse. The people who built them understood cycles. They did not build for permanence, they built for recurrence. And now we must confront the most disturbing question of all. If previous civilizations were erased, who erased them? There are only three logical possibilities. The first is self-destruction. A civilization reaches technological maturity and collapses under its own weight. Energy systems destabilize, weapons escalate, ecosystems fail. The planet becomes uninhabitable. Survivors regress. Knowledge becomes myth. Tools become relics. This scenario is familiar because it mirrors our present trajectory. The second possibility is external intervention, not necessarily extraterrestrial in the way science fiction portrays it, but external to the civilization itself. A regulating force, a system that monitors development and intervenes when thresholds are crossed. The Earth may not be a random habitat, but a managed one. This idea feels paranoid until you realize how often ancient cultures described gods not as creators, but as administrators, watchers, judges, beings who arrived, ruled, and then departed, or promised to return. The third possibility is the most unsettling, that humanity itself is not native to this cycle, that we are settlers, introduced after the collapse of a previous world, grown, placed, or guided into an environment that already existed, given fragmented instructions that later became religion, left to operate systems we barely comprehend. If this is true, then many of our instincts make sense. Our obsession with domination, our fascination with ruins, our constant drive to extract, dismantle, and rebuild rather than harmonize. We are not at home here. We are occupants. This reframes ancient myths entirely. Flood stories become reset events. Tales of giants become eyewitness accounts. Descriptions of gods wielding thunder or fire become technological memory filtered through oral tradition. And the erasure begins to make sense. If advanced technology existed in the past, it would need to be removed to prevent rediscovery. Machines dismantled, knowledge centralized, artifacts hidden or altered, statues edited, books locked away, context destroyed. Not because humanity could not handle the truth, but because it could. Knowledge is power, and power is dangerous in the wrong phase of a cycle. This may explain why geology itself feels deceptive. Mountains that resemble stumps, canyons that look like excavations, rock layers that appear melted rather than eroded. What if we are misreading the scars of catastrophe as natural beauty? What we call nature may be infrastructure in ruins. What we call landscapes may be the skeleton of a dead world. And what we call progress may simply be repetition. The most chilling implication is not what happened before. It is what happens next. If civilizations rise and fall cyclically, then collapse is not a failure. It is a feature, a reset built into the system. And resets do not announce themselves. They begin quietly, with resource strain, with climate instability, with social fragmentation, with information overload, with technological arrogance. Sound familiar? Perhaps the statues were left intentionally, not as decoration, but as warnings. Evidence that mastery of matter does not equal wisdom, that control without restraint leads to erasure. The giants may not have vanished by accident. They may have crossed a line. And if that line exists, we are racing toward it. This is why history feels incomplete, why textbooks feel sanitized, why certain questions are discouraged rather than answered, why curiosity itself is often framed as dangerous. Because once you realize that the past was more advanced than the present, The future stops looking like salvation and starts looking like a test. We are not progressing towards something new. We are approaching something old. The reset does not require aliens. It does not require divine wrath. It only requires imbalance. When systems grow too complex, they collapse. When control exceeds understanding, destruction follows, and the earth resets. The silent stones around us are not mute because they have nothing to say. They are silent because we have not learned how to listen. The next time you walk past a ruined wall, a broken statue, or a mountain that feels strangely artificial, do not ask how old it is. Ask what it used to be. Ask who used it. Ask why it no longer functions. History is not behind us. It is beneath us, and it is waiting. If this perspective unsettled you, that means it worked. Discomfort is the first sign that a story you were given no longer fits the evidence. Curiosity is the beginning of recovery. Do not accept easy answers. Do not dismiss anomalies, and never assume that survival means superiority, because the ruins you walk on every day may belong to a world that once believed it had reached the end of history, just like we do.